Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone, and I think we are ready to start. So welcome everyone to today's Quantitative History Book Launch Series event, and jointly hosted by HKU Business School and also the Hong Kong Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences. And I'm Si Jie, and it's really my pleasure to be today's moderator. And today we are very honored to have Professor Bishnupriya Gupta with us to present her new book. Professor Gupta is a leading figure in economic history. She's now a professor of economics at the University of Warwick and also the co-editor for the Journal of Economic History. And her scholarship, particularly in South Asian economic history, spans diverse topics such as the Industrial Revolution, labor markets, long-term economic growth, the Great Divergence, and also gender inequalities. And today, Professor Gupta will present insights from her forthcoming groundbreaking book, An Economic History of India, Growth, Income, and Inequalities from the Mughals to the 21st Century. And the book offers a sweeping analysis of India's economic transformation over several centuries, addressing fundamental questions of growth, inequality, and structural change in both the pre-colonial and the post-colonial eras. And so before we begin, just a brief note on today's format. Professor Gupta will give about an hour lecture on her book, and then following that, we will have a Q&A session. We'll open the floors to our audience and also to our audience online. So for our audience online, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat box. Okay, so without further ado, I think please join me in welcoming Professor Gupta.
For inviting me to this venue and this talk. It's a great pleasure to be able to give you some insights from my book. It's actually the first one I'm doing about the book. As you can see, this is the cover of the book, and on the cover, the women are the textile mill workers in a Bombay cotton mill in 1943. So what I want to convey really is the combination of modern enterprises as well as a lot of tradition, which kind of makes India quite unique, and I guess makes many parts of Asia quite unique as well. So what do I want to do in this book? One of the things I wanted to do in this book was to put all the data that is available together to build a narrative. Because economic history of most countries, especially colonial countries, is really kind of, it's a contested field. Because you want to blame the colonizers for everything that happened. And the others also sometimes think colonization was great. So the data is one way of trying to reconcile, different views in the literature, and that's what I've tried to do. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about growth and so income and change. So today India is a fast-growing emerging economy, but at the time of independence in 1947, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. And I'll show you that graph in a minute, but here's a quote from one of the pioneering economic historians of India, Bagchi, who passed away very recently. And he wrote in his book of 1972 that in 1947, India, the brightest jewel in the British crown, was one of the poorest countries in the world. And you can see this indeed was true. The red bar here is India, and it is really poor in the Asian countries decolonizing at this time, and also very poor compared to the countries in Africa, which decolonized soon after. And the tall bars are all Latin American countries, which were independent for several years. So it is an interesting picture to keep in mind as we go along. what I want to think of today is how did India get there? So just a little bit of narrative. The first government of independent India wanted to build an industrial country. So when you look at growth rates, you don't see a fast growth rate like in East Asia. But you do see growth. And this was a structural break compared to the colonial period. So here's the graph. If you look at the pre-colonial India, there is a slight decline, right, from 1600 to 1750. And I'll show you that in more detail as I go along. And then you have the rule of the East India Company here. They became the ruler of Bengal and then more provinces. And this is the rule of the British Crown. You don't see anything changing much in this time. And this is the independence. So if we look at this trend, this is the structural break. So India may not have grown that fast, but it did grow in a significant way after independence. And that's the narrative I want to tell today, that how come India did not grow in a regime that was free trade driven, free trade, free capital flows, but you don't see much growth at this time. But then you come to a regulatory regime of independent India between 1950 and 1980. There is actually a positive growth. So what is this story that we should try to understand? And here, I think the historical perspective helps us to get some sense of what's going on. So my question today is going to be, how did India get to that red bar you saw? Did the global connections with the British Empire not help in its development? And then how did the regulated economy of India compare? And then this is a question, you'll see the term myth and reality appearing in several slides. What are the myths and realities of British colonization? And I think there are some myths, and I want to kind of address them head on. What I'm going to do in my book is to draw on data as evidence, and I'm going to think of development and underdevelopment under colonization and beyond that. So here's a map of colonial India. The darker regions, which are all over the place, are princely states. And these are political entities which are ruled by the local rulers who coexisted with the British rulers. So it's a kind of harmonious relationship, and at least for some time. And here is a map of independent India and Pakistan. And you can see on the west, there is West Pakistan, and in the middle, kind of east middle, there is East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh. When I talk about India at this time, I'm going to really talk about India and not Pakistan and Bangladesh, which kind of remains somewhat outside the scope of this book. But when I talk about colonial India, it will involve the whole geographic region. So here is the starting point of myths and realities. So what is the view on colonization of India? And this is from a very famous book by Niall Ferguson, written before 2003, but this is one of the editions. He argued, and the book is about how Britain made the world, and he argued that the average incomes in India rose only by 14%, while British income rose by 347%. But then the interesting thing is he went on to argue, even if British rule didn't increase Indian incomes, it could have been worse. So, it makes you think that, is it based on any evidence? A second view, which is on the other extreme, written by an Indian politician of the Congress Party, Shashi Tharoor, he wrote this quite famous book now, sold millions of copies, called Inglorious Empire. And in this, he argued that or he made a statement. It's not based on much evidence. Britain's industrial revolution was built on the destruction of the Indian textile industries. So he went on to show that how India Indian industry was destroyed as a result of British rule, and then Britain began to sell cotton textiles to India. So what is the reality? And the only way we can get some handle on it is to look at data, and that's what I'm going to do. So one of the first evidence on the quality of life in India comes from the accounts of travel writers and people who documented the courts. And they talked about this very vibrant urban economy and society. Some of them talked about how wealthy the emperors were, how rich the tradesmen were. We also know from the data that exists on trade that Indian textile trade was booming in the 17th and the 18th century, and India was one of the main suppliers of cotton textiles in the world market. But there is very little evidence here on how the average Indian lives. And that's going to be the focus of my book, that I want to see the average per capita income rather than what the emperor had. Of course, the emperor had lots of wealth and was one of the richest persons in the world, but didn't make any effect on the life of the ordinary person in the country. Okay, so let's turn to this main debate in Indian colonial history, is that this was a really wealthy industrial country producing textiles. And the British came and they led to, that led to deindustrialization. And without the British coming, India might have been a real industrial power. Okay, so let's just look at the evidence here. On the right-hand side, you'll see one of the textile products of what was produced in India in the 17th and 18th centuries. It is explicit. It was in high demand in the European market. The arrival of the European trading companies, they were the British, the French, the Dutch, and the Danish. They all bought textiles and took it back to Europe. And this was one of the main products. The advantage of the traditional handloom sector was the cheap labor cost and the quality of design and the skills the craftsmen had. I mean, I was reminded of the Indian trade when I visited the Palace Museum the other day. You see all these exquisite goods. And, when you see an exhibition on Indian textiles from this time, you see all these really fantastic textiles which were traded in the world market, and the trade increased in the 18th and 19th century. In 1757, the East India Company conquered Bengal. And now, instead of paying with gold to buy the textiles, they paid for textiles with the revenue they collected in Bengal. So it changed the political and the economic relationship between India and Britain. In 1858, the Crown rule of India began. And you can see that over time, India converted from being an exporter of industrial goods to an exporter of agricultural products. So I just want to point a few things on that list. You can see that in 1811, textiles are 33% of total trade. By 1850, it's 3.7%. So this is a massive decline. And you can think of this as deindustrialization, right? And then you have opium in 1850, it's like 30%, most of it coming to China. There is tea becoming increasingly important. There is indigo, there is raw cotton. All these are agricultural products. So what is the myth about deindustrialization? And I do think there is a myth. And this is that Indian traditional textiles were wiped out by British competition. And this is goods from the Industrial Revolution, right? and India as a colony could not impose any tariffs. So it is true that India was not allowed to impose any tariffs. A 5% tariff imposed on imports for revenue purposes were always compensated by internal duties which Lancashire wanted to be imposed on Indian products. So by 1870, 60% of the Indian market was supplied by British goods. So clearly there is a decline of this particular industry. But if you want to know the reality, this is only 10% of employment in the export industry in Bengal, which was the major center for producing textiles. So it's not such a large sector. Employment in this sector declined quite dramatically. So the estimates range from being 50% to 28%. So, it's a significant decline. But it did not have a big effect on the Indian economy overall. And that makes you think that, was India such a large industrial powerhouse? And is it that competition made this industry disappear? And I'll show you what happened after 1870. One of the other kind of side effects of this was that because British goods were cheaper, the average person began to buy more textiles. So from 1880, a domestic cotton textile industry, a modern industry using machinery from Britain, began to develop in India. And I'll talk about that later on. So here's a view that Steve Broadberry and I argued in a paper in the Economic History Review in 2009. The idea here is very simple. The idea was that imports of Indian textiles opened up possibilities of import substitution in Britain because they were buying these the Indian textiles. And if you think of Britain as a free trade nation, in 1700, Britain imposed the Calico Acts. These are basically banning import of printed textiles from India for the British market. They eventually banned import of all Indian products into Britain. And of course, the Industrial Revolution followed. So I'm not trying to argue that this is the only connection, but the fact that there was an import substituting cotton textile industry in Britain definitely owes its origins to the imports of cotton textiles from India. So how did this happen? British technology, the technology of the Industrial Revolution, we heard about so eloquently from Joel Mokyr, was labor saving. So on the left-hand side, you have an Indian spinner, a woman spinner who worked part-time mostly. It took 10,000 operative hours to process 100 pounds of raw cotton. And on the right-hand side, you have a machinery of the Industrial Revolution, which did the same thing in 2,000 operative hours. So you can think of the efficiency gain in the British industry. And over time, this became something like, 50 hours or 35 hours. So here is the calculation Steve and I did. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the input costs of British textiles relative to Indian textiles. So the input costs were twice as high in 1680, but by 1820, it's about 150%. Now look at the right-hand side. This is the price difference. The price of cotton textile in Britain relative to the price in India. It was double in 1660, but by 1820, it is only 35%. And all this was coming from the increase in total factor productivity of this particular industry. So you can imagine how whatever tariffs you want to impose on the Indian goods, British goods would have a huge competitive advantage in the Indian market. So the deindustrialization, which we argued, is not necessarily as a result of the failure to have tariffs. It's also a result of the efficiency gains that came from the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so in reality, when you look at what was going on in the economy as a whole, let me just show you this graph. This is the decline in Indian GDP per capita from 1600 to 1871. There's a slow decline. Relative to Britain, there's a massive decline. So this is the overall economy. Now what happens when we look at the sectors? These are the rise in industrial exports per capita over the same period. Now look at the rise in exports of agricultural products per capita over the same period. And now you can then see the changes in GDP per capita. And it's pretty obvious to anyone that once you put the data together, there's no relationship between the export growth and GDP growth in this period. The GDP growth really doesn't change very much. So what happens to what drives GDP growth? This is the output per head in this. The blue line is the GDP per capita. The orange line is the output per head in agriculture. And the next line, this is coming up now, is the output per head in industry. And what is driving the change in Indian incomes over this long run is really what was going on in agriculture. So what do we know about that? So let's look at agriculture. There, in India, the yield per acre in 1946, if you look at that in relation to what was produced in 1600, which is the time when the India was, well above the subsistence level, rice output in 1946 was lower than in 1600. So whatever the British policies were in agriculture, they didn't have any effect on yield per acre. And to me, this is a serious problem. If we want to blame the British for anything, this is what we should blame them for, the failure to do anything in agriculture. When you look at the growth rate in yield per acre on the right-hand side, you can see that food crops, yield per acre in food crops was declining over time. So this is a country which is really agricultural, did not see any kind of increase in products other than things like sugarcane, which is a cash crop. And this is where you see some increase in yield per acre as well. So to me, what policies of the British Empire were harmful to India? It is this policy. So why was there an ecological crisis? Investment trade in India in, let's say, the first half of the 20th century was 7% of GDP. And that's not going to take you very far, right? So agriculture, the largest sector, received less than a quarter of this investment. So there is some truth when economic historians have argued that the British did not care about agriculture, they cared about irrigation. They care about the railways. So I'll come to that in a second. I just want to show you that where land was irrigated, output per acre were higher. So on wheat yields on irrigated land in different provinces, the yields were higher. But less than 10% of the investment in the railways was made in irrigation. So clearly there was a failure of the British government in India to have an impact on the lives of the average person. So one of the myths in the literature is that the British wanted to build this railway network to send goods from the interior hinterland to the coast and then ship them off. So all the agricultural products which were shipped, and to import goods from the ports to to the interior of the country. And if you look at the railway map in 1870, it does give you a sense that this was perhaps the case, that, all the railway lines connect the hinterland to the port. But now when you see the map in 1901, and it went on getting denser subsequently, you'll see that the most of the country is connected by the railway network. And now we have really good research which shows that the railways integrated markets. So Dave Donaldson's very well-known work and John Hurd's work in 1975, they show that prices converged across markets. It reduced the incidence of famine, that's Donaldson and Burgess. It generated social savings, Bogart and Chaudhary. But what was lacking in the railway development, that it had no impact on agricultural productivity. It also created few linkages with industries. So in most countries in Europe, the railways had a big effect on the backward linkage industries. So the iron and steel production, wagon building, etc. This was very minimal in India. So did India not modernize it at all? And I'm going to argue here is that India did modernize in a way that we probably don't expect in the context of a developing country or in the context of a colonial country. The reality was that a modern industry emerged in India, a modern industry in the sense of using modern machinery, modern technology. And this emerged from the middle of the 19th century. The tea and the jute industries were set up with British capital. So this was something where India gained from capital flows from Britain to India. But there was a modern textile industry that emerged, which was set up mainly with Indian capital. So Indian entrepreneurs who made a lot of money in trade, so the opium trade to Shanghai and other parts of China generated massive wealth for the trading communities. The trade in raw cotton during the Civil War generated massive wealth. These were the groups that began to set up textile mills, buying machinery from Britain and bringing them to India. This industry was second largest to tea as a modern sector in the country at that time. So this sector was small, but it was influential. The Indian National Congress, which led the independence movement, consulted with many people in this, many of the industrialists, and they coordinated a lot together on what policies to adopt once independence was attained. So here's a picture of growth in output per worker. I showed you yield per acre in agriculture. Here you get output per worker in agriculture, industry, and services. And you can see, there's very little growth. There's no growth in agriculture for a very long time. But industry is the fastest growing sector in terms of productivity. Services is also was growing fast from the 20th century. There were two sectors in industry. One was the traditional sector, which was small scale, and the other, the blue bars, are the modern sector which began to emerge. It was really small at the beginning, but when you come to 1945, the small scale and the modern sectors are roughly equal in size. So all the productivity gain that you see in industry was coming from the modern industries that emerged during the colonial period. So I just wanted to show you this table because there are many names that are familiar here. Tata in particular is a name which is kind of known internationally. It is one of the companies which invests all over the world. If you look at 1939, you'll see Tata as a leading business group. And this is a firm which started in the textile industry in the late 19th century, moved on to iron and steel during the First World War, and then moved to various other sectors. And today is really one of the powerful business groups in India, and you can see they're one of the top two year after year. In 1939, there were two Indian groups in the top, this is top 10 business groups. One is Tata, and the second one is E.D. Sassoon. This is a group of Baghdadi Jews who were persecuted in Baghdad and moved to India early on. And they set up a lot of textile firms. They were in the opium trade, they set up the textile firms. And then you see a lot of British companies. But once you come to 1958, the British companies in the top 10 have more or less disappeared. It's the Indian firms which became really dominant at this time. And they were dominant not just in the 1950s, they had been quite important even earlier on. They had grown a lot during the colonial period. So I do not think that industry, I've done a lot of work on Indian industry in the colonial period, and I do not believe that this was a sector that was stifled by colonization. If anything was stifled, that was agriculture. The second myth I want to kind of address is that there is this widespread belief that the British introduced a modern education system, and not just a modern education system. They introduced English education to India, and that had massive benefits. Universities were set up in 4 metropolitan cities in the 19th century, so India had a significant, very well-educated group of Indians. But how many were educated? That's the question, right? I mean, we did have English education. In 1931, less than 10% of the population was literate. There was a large gap between male and female literacy, 17% for males and 3% for females. Only 142 out of 1,000 school-age kids were at school. This was one of the lowest in the world. In terms of per student expenditure, India had one of the lowest spendings within the British Empire, but also in comparison to the princely states that I talked about. You know, the independent states in India, which were run by local rulers. So primary education was never a priority of the British government, even when there was some demand for it, and when it was being rolled out in Britain as a compulsory education system. This is one of the most interesting differences in policy, and I think an exploitative one, because the British wanted to build to create a class of Indian civil servants who could run the country. And so primary education was never a priority. So what was the priority? Here you can look at what was going on in secondary education. As a share of spending, you can see that secondary and tertiary education actually accounted for most of the education spending. So a lot of spending was made for high quality secondary schools, but also high quality universities. So India did create this kind of, this elite English speaking group, which could work in the public services. Now, if you look at who actually, what are the sectors that benefited from the literacy in the colonial period, this evidence is coming from 1921. So you have literacy on the x-axis and labor force participation in services in 1921. And you can see this very strong positive correlation. And what I would like to argue here is that the people who benefited from the education system were those castes who already had some literacy. And these castes were all in the service sectors. They were the Brahmins or the priests. They were the traders. They all needed some basic literacy for their occupation. So when the education system modernized, they could then, move into the modern sectors. And when you look at data on who were in the medical schools, who were in training as lawyers, these were people from only a certain castes. And these castes all tended to be the upper castes in the service sector. So let me now kind of say something about independent India. How am I doing for time?
Still,
Oh,
5 minutes.
India was poor in 1947, as you saw. So at the time of independence, the first Prime Minister of India, Nehru, his goal was to make India a developed country. And the way he thought of it was that enough must be done to make this country industrial. So industry had developed, but it was a very small part of the economy. So let's now try to make it kind of a bigger part of the economy. India was not alone in this. This was the policy followed in many Latin American countries or other colonies coming out of colonization. So the result was that India moved from being a completely open economy or largely an open economy to one of the highly regulated economies of the world. It used tariff policies, it used quotas in imports, it used industrial regulation to decide where industries could be set up. It also regulated who could invest in industry. So there were 5-year plans were introduced after 1950. The first plan focused on building agricultural infrastructure, but from the second plan, a Soviet-style industrialization strategy was adopted. So the idea here was that develop a capital goods sector, which can then raise the rate of investment in the economy. So India went in this direction of a serious import substituting industrialization. And the strategy, as we know in the case of many import substituting industrializations, that the strategy pays off for a short time. There's a upward trend in the industrial growth, but it soon begins to taper off because these industrial goods cannot compete in the world market. So India did build this massive industrial sector. So what about growth? So one of the myths that you have in the literature, I think it is a myth because it is not saying anything inaccurate. It's saying India was growing at 2% a year in terms of GDP per capita. This is really low compared to what was going on in East Asia, for example. But it is a myth because it doesn't look at what went on before 1950. The starting point is 1950. The reality is that in comparison to the fast-growing economies of Asia, East Asia, India was doing badly. But in comparison to other developing countries, no. In comparison to India's long-term trend, it was actually doing quite well. So in reality, this was a reversal of fortune. This is how the GDP per capita changed over time. You can see that after 1950, it starts moving up. And for the first time from almost, of decades of 0% growth in GDP per capita, there was a positive a change. So what changed to bring this, to bring about this growth in GDP per capita? This is changing agricultural productivity. And you can see that this is work of Kurosaki in Hitotsubashi, and he's documented these trends in agricultural output per worker over yield per worker over a century. And you can see the flat line in all three countries, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. But then you see the upward trend after independence. So where did this come from? It came from the expansion in rural infrastructure, irrigation and roads and so on. It came from the Green Revolution, which is the introduction of new technology in agriculture, particularly seeds, fertilizers and so on. And it came from institutional changes in agriculture, land reforms, and having credit institutions which were run by the state. In industry, this was also a rapidly changing economy. The rate of investment rose from 7% of GDP in 1940 to 17% in 1960, and then continued to rise further. When you look at the rates of growth in different sectors, you can see that in capital goods, the rates of growth were very high under the second plan. And it's only it only started to slow down after about 10 years. What was very important in Indian industrial development at this time was a lot of the industries were dominated by the public sector, because the government did not allow the private sector to invest in many of the industries. So public sector was kind of the driver of industrial growth at this time. And this is the changing sectoral shares. You can see agriculture is the largest component. It continues to remain the largest component until here, and then begins to decline. You can see the large-scale industry, which is the red bar, which rises quite significantly over time, but doesn't change that much. What changes is the share of the service sector. And this has become the largest sector today, but it has also been one of the most dynamic sectors in India for a very long time. So just very briefly, I think this is out there in the literature, that there was an efficiency cost of regulation. There was foreign exchange crisis, exports did not grow. And then from 1980, almost the same time as the economic reforms in China, India began to liberalize, first allowing industrial location to be leave it to the private sector. So the private sector was given a lot of free hand after that. So industrial regulation declined. This period is being described by Roderick and Subramaniam as the pro-business reforms. And after 1990s, India went more for a market-based reform, so changes in the exchange rate and allowing foreign investment to come in. And here is the rates of growth of a certain over time. Empire, no growth. 1950 to 1980, 1.4% growth. 1980 to 1990, 3% growth, and then after 1990 to 2000, 4% growth. So if you look at the whole century, you'll see 1950 as a structural break. If you look at 1950 to 2000, you'll see 1980 as a structural break. So it really makes a difference to take a historical perspective. So you saw the big increase in the service sector's share of the service sector in GDP. I don't have it here in the slides, but it has also been a very productive sector in terms of output per worker, and I'll show you some evidence in a couple of slides. So it has been, the services has been the fastest growing sector in India over a long period of time. And if you look at the data, this is also the sector which has the highest concentration of workers with secondary and tertiary education. So therefore, there is some historical legacy of the colonial policies that can explain why service sector growth has been so important in the Indian context. So this graph shows you the literacy by sector, so primary, secondary, and tertiary education. And you can see that two sectors have a large share of workers without any education. This is the blue bar. This is agriculture, mining, and manufacturing. When we look at the service sectors, these all have highly educated workers. So this could be a factor which is driving the service sector success in India. So this is not just in modern services. This is in almost every service sector that you can see the breakdown. And when we look at productivity differences with the UK, you can also see the catching up of the service sector. So all other sectors kind of stay, the agriculture declines relative to Britain in terms of labor productivity. Industry stays roughly the same, but it is in the service sector India has been catching up with Britain. And I think it is the colonial legacy which also can explain India's service sector advantage. Okay, in the last 15 minutes, I want to say a little bit about inequalities. And there are various ways to think about inequality in India. In the book, I look at 4 inequalities: the regional, income, caste, and gender. Today, I'm not going to talk about caste and gender because these are topics on their own, and they require a lot of time, to explain what's going on. So I'm going to look at 2 different types of inequality at this time. And the first one is going to be differences across regions. And is there persistence or is there change? So the reason, so what I'm going to kind of show you here is the rank of provinces in terms of GDP per capita in 1911. That is on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, you have rank in GDP per capita of the provinces in 2003. And what stands out here is this: Gujarat and Maharashtra. Like in India, there's a lot of discussion about Gujarat model or Maharashtra model as being the success story. But these were also the most developed states in colonial India. So if you bring a historical perspective, you will think of this as persistence. The richer states continue to remain rich. Then there are these poor states here, which include one of the largest provinces in northern India. It was poorer earlier on, it's poorer today. And everything in the middle, there has been some churn. So Kerala, you can see Kerala was quite rich in the colonial time, now kind of in the middle. So there has been a churn in the middle, but at the extremes, there have been very little change. The second inequality I want to talk about is income concentration over the 20th century. And this is not my work. This is work coming from Alvarado and co-authors and Banerjee and Kennedy. So what they do is they look at urban incomes. Almost very few people in India pay income taxes. So in some sense, tax data doesn't tell you very much, but it does tell you what happens to the top end of the income distribution. So here you can see that the 0.1% had a very high share of the top income. This is a decline, and this decline coincided with the regulatory policies of independent India. And since liberalization, you can see this going up. So this is the first point to make here, that income has been very concentrated in the hands of a few people. But what is interesting in the Indian case, which is very different from what you can find in Africa or in many other parts, is that in this top income share here, there are many Indians. So 4% or 40% is accounted for the colonial rich. The rest is accounted for by the wealthy traders and the industrial interests in colonial India. It doesn't include any agricultural income, so I can't say anything. But this is an interesting picture and I think India therefore is quite different in terms of the wealth of the local entrepreneurs and the traders in the income distribution. Okay, and this is where I'm going to be a little bit wave my hands, but I'm just going to say something about India's development in a comparative perspective. And I'm going to look at differences with East Asia. And here I'm kind of thinking of East Asia in quite a narrow sense. I'm thinking of Korea and Taiwan in the colonial period and how their development has emerged subsequently. So here are two graphs. One is of the colonial period. The red one is India, and then you have blue is Taiwan, South Korea is yellow. Sorry, Indonesia is yellow in the colonial, my mistake. But you can see that they all converge pretty close. There's not that much difference between India, Korea, Taiwan, and Indonesia. Now, when you look at the post-independence, you'll see the big divergence between South Korea and Taiwan pulling away from India and Indonesia. So how can we think of the colonial period? I mean, I don't want to say the Japanese were very good colonizers, because that's not the point. I just want to say that they had different policies. And one reason they had different policies is because they were close. This is my conjecture, right? I mean, I'm going to wave my hands a lot in this chat. That they, because of Japan's proximity to Korea and Taiwan, Japan began to rely more on agricultural imports in the beginning from these two countries. So rice was one of the main imports, and Japan invested a lot to make agricultural productivity, increase productivity in rice cultivation. In the second period, they wanted to develop Korea as an industrial satellite for producing for the war. So its proximity to Japan's proximity to the colonies made the geographic context very different from India and Britain, where India was never important to Britain as an industrial producer. The only thing Britain imported from India were goods that were complements to the British system, but not anything that was substitutes. So what I want to focus here is that when you look at the share of manufacturing in Korea and Taiwan, South Korea in particular, and India at the time in 1950, they're not that different. There's something around the figure of 13% of GDP. And that makes you think that where is this difference coming from for their next level of change? How come South Korea began to grow so fast and Taiwan too? So I'm going to think of two differences in this context. One is going to be agriculture. So agriculture is at the heart of the story of colonial underdevelopment. Because of Japan's interest in procuring rice from the colonies, Japan invested a lot in agricultural infrastructure. Not just irrigation, but also providing new types of seeds. So agricultural productivity increased a lot. So 80% of the land was irrigated in Taiwan and 68% in Korea. By comparison, the figure in India is 20%. So you can see the big difference in the priorities of colonial policy. And the second difference is the colonial government in Korea and Taiwan invested much more in primary education. So on the right-hand side, this is a graph built from the data, which Sungo actually lent to me very kindly. You can see the big rise in public schooling in public school enrollment during the colonial period. So Korea and Taiwan both had this big advantage in primary education and not so much in secondary education. But why should this matter? So one way it mattered is that these East Asian economies were able to have really educated workers in their industries. Whereas Indian workers, as you saw from that graph, many of them did not have even basic literacy. And that had implications for productivity in the industrial sector. Of course, we know this, so I don't want to say too much. This is Dwight Perkins and John Tang have a paper from 2017, and they argue that East Asia followed an impulse substituting industrialization only in the learning phase, only in the 50s. Then they moved to export promotion and used the world market as their main market for growth. The years of education also increased dramatically in the two countries. So from about 3.2 years of education in 1960 to eight years in 1994, by comparison, the rise in India is 1.3% to 3.4%. So that has an effect on how skilled the workers are. And if human capital matters for growth, this is where you can find that effect. So concentration of workers in the secondary and tertiary education in services in India is a whole different story. And this is where India's advantage lies. So today, when you look at growth across these countries, you'll see that India's growth is led by the service sector, whereas other countries, the growth has been led by the industrial sector. So I'm going to conclude here. What I've tried to argue in this presentation is that Indian incomes declined from 1650 as it integrated to the global market. So globalization had very little effect on giving prosperity during this long span of 3 or 4 centuries. This doesn't surprise me because if we think of Luigi Pascali's work, his work shows that in the first phase of globalization, the countries which gained were those countries which had good institutions and others did not. So it could have been, trade could have been a source of the Great Divergence, and India could be in that one data point in that story. A reversal began with the regulatory regime in independent India, and this is something we don't expect. But it is true, the colonial growth was so dismal that even a 2% growth is a structural break after independence. So the historical differences in colonial policies in East Asia and India may explain some of the differences that we see today. And I think the book has tried to provide an evidence on why history matters in understanding the present. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Now the floor is open. Yes.
I'm so very glad to listen to your lecture. And I am the comparative postdoc student, and I'm focusing on Korean economic history. So the Southeastern Asia countries' industrialization is one of my most important research. So I feel quite interesting to know the comparison perspective for the Eastern Asia country and India. And I also do some research about the literacy rate and the education and the later industrialization effect. And I feel I can give some, maybe just some thoughts, relevant thoughts, based on the previous slides. I feel, just like you said, the education during the colonial time will be a very important difference for the different paths of the development in India and the Eastern Asian countries, because based on some current literacy that literature that Japanese is a very important language in East Asia when during the second industrialization and industrial revolution times. they convey a lot of new knowledge and new technology to the Asian country, and basing on the general education spreading the tendency, so make a lot of people have a higher literacy rate, no matter you're very senior people or very grassroots. So that the literacy rate spreading from not the high level people is a very important precondition for the later development. And also, I think the mechanism is because the not very high level people, for example, the workers, they are have a literacy rate. So there will be play very important role to new technology adoption. So that's the reason why higher manufacturing ratio will be in the pre-modernization times. That means the colonial time. So it will be the very important foundation for the later independent industrialization, but also very important for the industry policy. So I feel that will be a very interesting topic. Maybe I can contribute on it. So thank you for that.
Thank you for your comment. That's most reassuring.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for your wonderful presentation. My name is Joost Vonk. I'm a professor here at HKU. I have a question for you. I will try to keep it short, shorter than previously. You showed two different slides when it comes to the GDP. One at the beginning of your talk and one sort of halfway. The first one, surprisingly, at least for me, showed that there was a growth in the GDP for India during the 1930s. So Wall Street crash 1929 is still the growth of GDP in India. It seems to be quite surprising. The other slide that you showed that the GDP was focusing on four different periods. One, 1914 to 1945, and 1945 to 1980, I believe, and 1980 1990 to 2000. And you show the differences in the growth. But of course, we're also looking at different periods, 30 years, 35 years, 10 years, 10 years. You can elaborate a little bit on the effect. If you were to split up in 10-year segments, then the effect might be even more significant for us to show, to realize. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. So I think the only period where I show some positive GDP growth is not 1930s. It's late 19th century. So you do see a little bit of an upturn because agricultural exports become quite important. So that you see that slight upturn there. No, I take your point that the periods are different, and I think the periods that are there are more kind of political breakpoints rather than economic breakpoints. So no, that point is well taken. Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Gupta, you mentioned the term regulation many times in the presentation. Sometimes you refer to industrial policy, sometimes you talk about pro-business versus pro-market reforms in the 80s and 90s. From your research, you mentioned that the East Asian countries' industrial policy in the early learning stage is useful, but then it hinders progress when industry takes off. What would it be? And the industry policy at this moment is also very popular and heated debated topic in China. And so I would like to tap into your expertise in the history of India and elaborate a little bit more on your view about the role industry policy plays in the development of the economy.
Thanks for the question. So it is very interesting for me to see the collaboration between the Indian National Congress, which is the party of the independence movement, and the industrial entrepreneurs. So one particular thing they discussed during colonial time, so sometime early 1940, is suppose India gets independence, what type of development would you like? And they have this document called the Bombay Plan, where the private sector is very happy for the government to the public sector to be an investor. Because I think there's a lot of uncertainty at that time on moving into capital goods production. None of these groups have that much experience. So they are quite happy to let the government be the risk taker. So, so the industrial policy of this period is not something that is totally imposed by the government. It is kind of in consultation. And the Indian private sector for a very long time benefits from the closed market. So they are not that bothered that, they are not, so only when the growth rate starts slowing down, there is rethinking. And the first step that is taken is a policy that is not to open up, but a policy that gives the private sector more access to different sectors. So the regulation on the private sector goes away. So they are very happy at that point. And the opening up of India is really a post-1990, when you open up just foreign investment and so on. So it is, to me, the industrial policy has not really succeeded because you don't see industrial growth taking off in this big way. Of course, there are some companies like Tata's, they own the steel plants in the UK now. So it is kind of a very big reversal of fortune that colonial company is now kind of dominating the British industrial sector. I think to me, East Asian industrial policy is the policy to look out for, how they develop different sectors and make them competitive in the world market. But you also need an education policy which will allow that to happen. So I don't know whether that satisfies your question, answers your question. But these are my thoughts.
Thank you very much for that. I guess what I have in mind is that when you look at the comparative experience of East Asian countries, and Economist magazine just criticized India's industrial policies all the time, but they often cite the examples of East Asian countries as well. But one particular factor that I think that is often left out of the discussion is the fact that India, like China, is a very populous country. With the population, even back in 1947, the population of India probably was multiples of that of Britain, which is not the case for Taiwan and Korea relative to Japan. So 2 years ago, when the Delta virus broke out, there was a lot of outcry in India about the lacking of the entire industry supply chain for the vaccine. So to me, I think that size plays probably a very distinct role in the effectiveness of industrial policy. So I was kind of hoping to understand, maybe there have been discussions along this line. For a small country, you have to be open. You can develop your competitive advantage in the globalization. But for a large country like India, first of all, the other countries cannot absorb all of your capacity. Second, you have to, it's imperative for you to maintain the completeness of the industrial spectrum. And so that's kind of where I was kind of hoping to share your insights.
So I think that there is not that much discussion, at least in that amongst the academics, about the size of the two countries. But it is a fair point that if you're a small country with a small market, you have to open up earlier than later. That is a good point. I think in India, most of the discussion has been on regulation. That the regulation on private sector stifles it. And the first reforms therefore gave them that whole the experience where they could operate in different places. But I think unless there is a discussion in India on how to develop human capital, this is not going to, they cannot replicate the South Korean example. And all the discussion has always focused on the failure vis-a-vis East Asia. And that's why I want to look at these two countries. And I was surprised when their share of industrial output and GDP was actually pretty comparable. That's
Thank you very much, Vishnu. So the conclusions you have drawn are very exciting because the first two conclusions are contrary to what I would expect. First, income decline right after India was brought into the global economy, particularly the British Empire. And then secondly, there was a reversal after the independence. The Prime Minister introduced a lot of regulations to really isolate the Indian economy from the global economy. But then growth happened during the first few decades at least. So what are the real reasons for the Indian experience to be really quite different from China's experience, right? Because for China, at least for most of the last 1,200 years, when China was open, then much more growth than when China was closed off from the rest of the world, and not much growth or a lot of decline. Also bringing what Pinion just said. So maybe could it be because India was actually quite fragmented even under the British rule, because there were effectively many different kingdoms with different languages and so on. I mean, so effectively under the British rule, there were internally extremely segmented markets, so that internal indigenous growth might have been prevented from happening. Maybe the caste system. Of course, it's very interesting to compare the Indian literacy rate over the number of years of education, where those in South Korea, Japan, and China. So I'm just trying to understand why that's the case, because the first two conclusions are really contrary to what we learned from the textbooks, right? So.
No, I think this is true. And so when we think of open economies today, we think of capital flows, trade flows, not so much labor flows, but let's say for the first few. When you look at the empire context, I think the trade flows were large, but they were of a certain type. They were agricultural goods flowing into the imperial countries. So the gains from industrialization never accrued to the colonies. So I think this could be a big difference why trade did not play such an important role. Of course, countries such as, if I put Malaysia there, you will see that there is some growth. There are agricultural exporters, small country agricultural exporters, which did grow. But India was not that sort of a country. It wasn't exporting such a big volume. It was never that important in British trade. In terms of capital flows, now this is the work I'm doing at the moment. Their capital came to tea industry, railways, and this industry called jute. It's a product which makes bags for gunny bags. So when you have a war or a flood, you stuff these bags and we build a barrier. It's those things. So India produced, the British invested in those industries because they were used in the British market. There was no capital flow to cotton textiles, so it's not really a globalized economy in that sense. So I think the colonial economy is very different from what we mean by globalization today. And I think, and so that's why I always refer to Luigi Pascali's work, where he says that countries which benefited were those which have good institutions, so Australia, New Zealand, so on. Whereas India, I don't think had good institutions in the same way, and therefore may not have benefited more. So you're surprised at this break in 1950? I think it's only because growth was zero before that. If you go from zero to whatever, this is making a structural change. So in that sense, I think the first growth you see in India after 50 years is really under regulation.
So I thought from the work by Thanos, it shows that even in India, with the railroad networks being constructed, goods were really flowing more easily and in much faster ways. So that's why during natural disasters, death rate and the suffering were shown to be much reduced with the railroad network. So I thought that's like really strong evidence indicating, once you have such physical transportation infrastructure in place, even in India, then you do the usual trips. But just like in China, the canal system, right, was initially constructed to transport tributary or tax grains. Still, it allowed a lot of people to piggyback a lot of goods to go from one location to another to really get the commercial activities also go up accordingly. But I thought a similar experience, even in unintended ways, should have been the case in India.
So I think you're absolutely right that there is market integration because of the railways. So you see the big price differences kind of shrinking. You see less incidents of famines because you can transfer goods. But I think what is driving everything is this agricultural decline. Most of the land is producing food crops. So if productivity in those lands is declining, the aggregate effect on GDP is coming from that rather than the railways. The other problem with the railways in India is on industry. So if you think of Germany or the United States or Britain, there is this massive backward linkage which generates industrial activity, right? And in India, this didn't happen because everything was imported from India. So the backward linkage industries just did not appear in colonial India. And in that sense, this whole emphasis on capital goods is coming from that shortfall, that you don't have a sector which produces machinery. Even textile machinery, there was nothing. Everything was imported. So I think that's why you see this kind of muted effect of the railways, which is there in most countries, that you will see a big effect of railways. I think it doesn't do anything for agricultural productivity. It just smooths market fluctuations.
Thank you.
Well, this is a great accomplishment. So I want to engage you with the fourth bullet point in the conclusion, which inspires me to think about the issue of colonial origins. So there are two dimensions to this question. So the first is that the same colonizer may actually have different colonial policies depending on the factor and environment of the country being colonized. So I was thinking, so perhaps Britain could have very different colonial policies with Hong Kong vis-a-vis India. And my sort of vague memory seems to suggest that Hong Kong had a 9 years or 12 years of free education. So that sort of stands in some marked contrast with the Indians. The other question that inspires me to think about is to what extent could the underinvestment in primary education in India be attributed to the caste system rather than the colonial policy. So these are some of the nuances that I think you could conceivably expand in relation to it.
No, I think, yeah, so, yeah, thank you for those questions. So it is true that geography matters. So I don't know how to think of Hong Kong. Like Hong Kong in my 1950 graph would be twice as high as Singapore. So Hong Kong is already very wealthy. I just didn't put it there because it's so British, right? But you do have proximity to matter. So if you are going to import food from a colony, then you can think about how you want to improve their agriculture. Britain didn't import anything from India, maybe some rice, but it's not their main consumption good. So their incentive to invest in agriculture was very low. They did try to do experiments in cotton because they were importing raw cotton, not much else. So that I think is clearly determined by geography and what you import from a country, and therefore the East Asian context is different. On education, I mean, clearly the caste system matters because in 1990, there was a Government of India Act, 1919, where they separated fiscal policies to the provinces, to give Indians some concession. So one of the things that were allocated to the provinces was education, that the provincial authorities or the local authorities could decide what they were going to do with education. So when it was on the local boards, there's work by Latika Chaudhary, which is very interesting. She shows that when the upper caste dominated in a district, they spent very little on primary education because they didn't want their kids to go to the same school as low caste children. So there is clearly that interaction. But from a colonial policy perspective, the provinces were ruled by the British as well. So there was a colonial administrator at the provincial level. So despite the autonomy, there's no pressure coming saying that, develop primary education. The British really wanted a very literate, English-speaking civil service class. And the upper castes were ready to join. So the caste system interacted with colonial policy without any doubt.
Thanks for that, Gupta. So I'm not an economist. I'm actually from the physics department and simply just attracted by your talk. So let me ask a very amateur question. I was also very surprised by your conclusion that the colonial British rule basically does not help the economy grow in India. In fact, agriculture, you said, even decline. So if you think about the hypothetically of this simple language, simple picture, if there were no British, India would on its own, a fraction of small countries, just with some local figurehead. With like in China, for example, the late Qing dynasty, eventually under the Western of the euphoric system collapse within itself, and then a new republic forms, and so on and so forth. You seem to say in India, if that were the case, we probably have the same result these days. I mean, if there were no British rule.
No, I didn't intend to say that.
I'm sorry.
So, but I think we don't know the counterfactual. I don't have counterfactual in mind. It's possible they could have been like the Qing dynasty and not done very much. But it is also possible that they could have had access to the capital market. They could have been like another country with some, like the Latin American countries. So in that sense, I think the counterfactual is impossible to tell. What I think, I've been thinking about this for some time now, that there was this argument in Indian economic history really strong that there was drain of wealth from India to Britain, and which is like your investable surpluses are going out of the country. But there is no good measure of it. This was a very political argument done in the 19th century, and the Marxist historians developed on it. It's a complicated calculation to make. Britain had access to the capital market. So of course you had capital flow, some capital, a lot of capital in the railways, steel. You were paying interest. That is not a drain. You just pay interest on capital. But what was a drain was they were paying Britain. Indian government was paying Britain, or British government in India was paying London, something called home charges. And this is the price to govern India. And this was thousands of pounds worth of resources that were being given to Britain. And this you can think of as drain, but it's a complicated general equilibrium type calculations, which maybe I'll do, but I haven't done so far. So I don't have an answer why, I think, I don't have a good answer why. I'm just showing you the data that there is no development or there's no growth in GDP per capita. I don't know the counterfactual, and maybe I will work on it. I don't know. Thank you.
Wonderful talk. I learned a lot from the talk. So I'm curious how history interacts with policy. During the colonial period, the British government did a lot of things, such as railway investment, market integration, or the adoption of modern administration systems. So after independence, the Indian government made a huge effort on industrialization using regulation policies. So I think without the initial efforts, the railway, the market integration, those industrial policies may not be very effective. So I'm curious how those historical events impact with current policies to shape today's India. So what's your thought?
Thank you. No, that's a great question. Like, would India have had railways just by borrowing from the world capital market and build a railway network? I don't know. Possible. Because, maybe the Mughal government, emperor would have borrowed, the Thai government did, right? Thailand was borrowed and built its railway system. So it's possible India is a bigger country. So maybe not this dense network that emerged. If there had been no drain of wealth from India to Britain for whatever sort, and would that have increased the rate of investment? Would that have led to industrialization? So, these are amazing questions, but I don't have answers to them. But I think somebody should work on it. Maybe not to me, I don't know. But, there might be some Indian student who will do something.
Professor, I'm Patrick Chu. I'm a right-hand pharmaceutical historian. I used to go to India very often, so I know a little bit about India. But coming back to you, as you mentioned, education is one of the most important factors in the growth and development of modern India. But we look back, for example, in China, now the literacy rate is about 95%, whereas India today is still about 77%. So going ahead, when you see, India will be able to increase its literacy rate from 77% to maybe 90%, where you see that the growth and development will become much faster, more sustainable.
So thank you for that question. I think it is true that India's performance on building human capital is very bad. Especially if I compare with China, for example, as you're saying, that this level of literacy, building literacy has not been there. But the other problem is the quality of education often is not very good. Like, you have lots of primary schools, but teachers don't turn up. And this has been the work by many people, development economists working there, that what does incentivize teachers to be at school and teach? So the quality of the workforce is really a critical one. And maybe when India reaches 95%, we will see it will get better. But I think it's also necessary to build a better education system. So the schooling system, especially the state public sector schools, are not very good in most places. So many average Indians would send their kids to a private school because it gives they think it offers a better education. People value learning English, so learning English gives you a huge advantage in the labor market. So all these interactions one can think of. Where it takes us, I don't know. It is a very unequal system, both in terms of education and in terms of access. James asked about the caste system. I mean, there is some work now that because the Indian government has affirmative action. So if you are from the lowest caste, you can get, there's 20% of the jobs are reserved for groups coming from tribes and scheduled castes. But also in universities and high academic institutions. So one of the top schools, if you go there, in this kind of, as a result of this affirmative action, the students do very well. When they come out, there's not much difference between them, their educational outcome, but their access is often not as much. So, the caste system still continues to interact at many levels on access and outcomes.
Thank you, and thank you, Professor Gupta. So our final question will come from our online audience, from Professor David Mitch. And he just trying to ask you about your views about trends in the last few decades in absolute poverty alleviation in India. And scholars have different views. So what is your view on the role of primary versus other sectors in driving poverty alleviation?
So thanks, David, for that question. I mean, I actually didn't say, I thought of having the slide, but I didn't in the end put it there. So you can see the work that has been done by Martin Gurley and co-authors is, you can see that a number of people under the poverty line, that has declined over time. But if you split it up by states, you will see that it has declined much more in the states that have grown faster. So growth is clearly one of the factors that reduce poverty. So this is people below the poverty line. The other thing which is also in the book is to look at what is the correlation between literacy in 1970 at the province level and decline in poverty. And then there's a correlation there too. So those states that are more literate tend to reduce poverty much faster. So both growth and literacy matter in terms of poverty reduction. So no doubt there has been massive reduction in poverty, but not as much as China has done, or so I also have that figure in the book. I can't remember it now. So the comparison is China looks much better in poverty reduction, success in poverty reduction compared to India.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Gupta, and also thank you all for joining us today.